Hello, I'm Georgia Churchill, the storyteller. A Portuguese story, Invisible Hands. Before I start, there are three things I'd like to tell you. Some of them you might know. Inn, I-N-N, is a little place where they have bedrooms and beds upstairs and food downstairs. This is about 300, 400 years ago. And a whitewash is a mixture of water and lime. It was what they used before they discovered paint. It goes way back to the Egyptian days, but it doesn't last very long. You have to whitewash over and over again. And then a vial is a little bottle, in this case, a little glass bottle about so big. All right. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in the beautiful land of Portugal, there was a young man who, like many young men and women before and since him, wanted to travel, to have adventures. In the course of his travels, he came to a town where none of the inns had a bed for him. Until finally one innkeeper said, "Well, if you just need a place to sleep, there's an old deserted mansion at the edge of town. Uh, Nobody's lived there for years and years, and you can stay there. Of course, some folks say it's haunted." And the young man said, "I don't believe in haunted houses." So he walked to the edge of town, and there's a big overgrown garden. He opened the gate, and then he had to push his way through the greenery of that overgrown garden until he reached the house. And it looked terrible that no one had been taking care of it for a long time. It had a big porch across the front, a big roofed porch. It looked like it was getting ready to fall off of the house. But he walked up the rickety steps and went to the door and decided he didn't really want to go in. He had a nice warm traveling cloak he could wrap around him, and the porch had a roof, and he could go down to one end and sleep there. So he lay down with his little soft sack of a few extra clothing that he carried around with him and settled down. When it got dark, right through the door drifted two hands. It was as though they were attached to a body, but the body couldn't be seen, only the hands. The hands were kind of honey brown colored, pretty. One of them was holding a candle. The other was beckoning. He stared at those hands, and then they turned and drifted and went back through the door. Well, he settled himself back down to fall asleep, but then the hands came back, one holding the candle and the other one beckoning. And he couldn't even tell himself why, but he got up and followed the hands to the door. They drifted right through. He had to open the door up, but it was beautiful inside. The floor was smooth, polished marble. The walls and the ceilings had been freshly whitewashed, and from the ceiling there hung a chandelier made out of crystal with what looked like hundreds of candles burning in it. And there were sconces on the walls that had candles. And in the middle of that bright room was a table with a clean white cloth on it, and on top of the cloth there was a great big meat pie, a great big salad, and a bottle of wine. And he realized he hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast. So he sat down and he ate that meat pie and drank the wine and ate the salad, and he was so tired. He put his arm on the table, put his head on his arm, and fell asleep. While he was sleeping, those two honey brown hands came over and lifted up his arm that was hanging by the side very gently, and they took off his ring. Put his ring on their thumb, took their ring off, put it on his pinky, and then lowered his hand down again. After a bit, he woke up. He had a crick in his neck from the way he'd been sleeping. He wished he had a nice, soft, clean bed. And whoa! All of a sudden he was in another room and there was a nice, soft, clean bed. So he kicked off his boots and crawled under the comforter and put his head on the pillow. But then he couldn't fall asleep because there was somebody in the room. He couldn't see anybody, but he just sensed it. And then he heard a voice. "Oh, sir, could you be brave enough to spend 3 nights in this old mansion? You will be hurt, but under the bed you will find 3 little glass vials. 1 drop from each vial in a goblet of wine, and all your hurts will disappear. Oh, please, sir, please, could you spend 3 nights here? I will reward you. I will give you 3 little sacks of gold, and when they are empty, you need only say, 'My, the gold is gone,' and they'll fill up. Oh, please, sir, please, could you stay?" And the voice disappeared. And the young man thought, "This place is really strange." But he pulled the comforter up closer around his ears and settled his head down on his pillow and was just drifting off when suddenly the comforter was jerked off of his body. Some cold, clammy hands grabbed hold of his ankles, pulled him right off the mattress. He landed with a thud on the floor. And then these hands, he couldn't see them, but they were tickling him. Oh, he didn't really like to be tickled. They kept tickling and tickling him. He tried to push the hands away, but although he could feel them tickling him, he couldn't find them when he was trying to push them away. So he just had to put up with being tickled. At first he was laughing all right, but then he started screaming and yelling, and he was kicking and writhing and trying to get away from the hands. And they just kept tickling him. Oh, they tickled and tickled and tickled and tickled. He thought he was going to wet his pants. And then the gray of the early morning that comes between night and before sunrise shone through the window, and the hands disappeared, thank goodness. Oh, he was bruised in places and scratched. I mean, the tickling was a little intense. He looked under the bed. There were 3 little glass vials, and there was a dresser with a goblet of wine on it. So he went over, drip, 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 drank down the wine. All the scratches disappeared. Where his clothes had gotten torn, it was as though they'd never been torn ever. And, well, he felt good. He walked into the front room, and there was the table with a loaf of fresh bread and something to drink. Coffee? I'd use hot chocolate if it were me. But anyway, there was a breakfast for him, but he was tired. So he went outside and he found some dappled shade. You know where the sun shines down through the leaves on a tree and it makes the ground kind of shady and kind of sunny all at the same time. He spread out his cloak and he slept. He slept until early afternoon. He went up to the house again and walked in through the door, and well, the table had a clean white cloth on it and a roast chicken and a big salad and another meat pie and a bowl of fruit and several desserts and 2 bottles of wine. So he ate and ate. He took his time. He finally ate it all up and drank all the wine, and then he stayed awake as long as he could, but finally, it was time to go to bed. So he did, and he just was falling asleep when the comforter was jerked off of him. Those cold, clammy hands grabbed hold of his ankles. They pulled him off the bed. He landed with a thud on the floor. But this time the hands weren't content with tickling. This time they were slugging him. Hitting him. Ow! On the jaw, on the kidneys. In the stomach. Ow! He was all curled up. He was worried about his temples where the bones are thin. He didn't want to get hit there. But, and as before, when he tried to push the hands away, he couldn't feel them, although he could certainly feel them hitting him. Oh my goodness, he curled up in a ball, he rolled around, he tried to get away from them. They just kept hitting him everywhere. Seemed to take a long time before he saw the gray in the window that comes before dawn. But when it shone through, the hands disappeared, thank goodness. And he looked underneath the bed, got out the 3 vials. Groaning, he walked over to the dresser and drop, out, drop, drank down the wine, and his eyes unpuffed so that he could see clearly. His nose went back into place. His loose teeth went back into his gums. His bruises disappeared. His kidneys stopped hurting. His belly stopped aching. In fact, oh my goodness, he felt pretty good. So he went into the front room and there was a breakfast for him on the table. But oh, was he ever tired. He slept out in the dappled shade until late afternoon. When he woke up, he wasn't altogether sure he wanted to go back into the house. But there was only one night left. He could get through it. And besides, the voice was pretty, and so were those honey-colored hands. So he went back inside, and whoa, the table had a clean white cloth on it, and there was a feast laid out on that table of roasted meats and vegetables and fruit and cakes and all kinds of desserts and 3 bottles of wine. Well, he ate, but he decided not to drink the wine because it was hard enough withstanding those invisible hands without being all muddled and fuddled by wine. So he took his time and he ate his way through that feast. And then he stayed awake as long as he possibly could. But finally, when his head was dropping down and then he'd wake up, well, it was silly to sit in a chair anymore, and so he went into the bedroom and climbed into the bed. But once he was in bed, he couldn't fall asleep. His eyes were just staring into the dark because he knew. And sure enough, the comforter was jerked off of his body. Those cold hands grabbed hold of his ankles. They pulled him off the bed, thud on the floor. Ooh. But this time it wasn't just tickling or slugging. This time, those invisible hands had a knife. Not a long knife, not the kind that can go into your stomach or your heart and kill you. This was just a knife with a little tiny blade, a fraction of an inch long, but it still cut. Oh, and it hurt. Oh, he was mostly worried about his eyes. So he didn't even want to try to push the hands away for fear his palms would get all cut up. So he just mostly covered his head and curled up and endured. Oh, gosh. It was terrible. At first it was just cutting his clothes, but it was warm in Portugal. His clothes weren't very heavy. Oh, my goodness. It seemed to take forever. He thought he was going to die. But finally, the gray light shone through the window, and the hands disappeared, and he dragged himself across the floor, leaving streaks of blood. Oh, he reached underneath the bed for the 3 little vials. He could hardly get over to the dresser. He had to pull himself up. Drop. He drank down the wine, and the pain went away. The cuts went away. He wasn't dripping any blood. His clothes were whole as though they had never been cut. In fact, well, he felt good. He walked into the front. Whoa, the front room! What had happened? the floor was all cracked and broken and uneven and filthy, and the walls were all stained brown as though the roof had been leaking, and the ceiling was sagging, and the chandelier was all broken. No candles. The sconces were on the floor or hanging upside down. No table. He went back into the bedroom. No bed, no dresser. But there in the middle of the floor were 3 little leather bags, and they were filled with gold coins. He picked up those bags and he got out of there. He walked into town and he had a good breakfast at an inn. And then he went out and he bought himself some new clothes. He ordered himself some Spanish leather boots. He bought a fine horse with a good saddle and brand new bridles and reins. And then he went walking through town while he waited for his boots to be finished, and found a nice little house with a little stable in the back, and flowers and some shade trees and some fruit trees and a little land around it, and he bought it. He went to the bank and made arrangements for an old couple to live there because he still wanted to travel. And by the time he had done all of that, well, the little sacks of gold were limp and flat and empty. My, he said, the gold is gone. And plump, they immediately filled with gold coins again. So he traveled on into Spain and down to the Mediterranean Sea, where he hired a little ship to take him across to North Africa, and went traveling through there for a while until he came to Morocco. And while traveling in Morocco, he came upon the most fabulous place. The house was gorgeous. There were palm trees and shade trees and fountains and flowers and a great big stable in the back, and orchards and fields of grain, and whoa, he bought it. It wasn't quite exactly the way he wanted it. So he hired some local workmen to fix it up a little here and a little there. And those local workmen went home and told their families that they were working for a young man who seemingly had an unending supply of gold. Well, that gossip spread around through the country fast enough until the Sultan, the king of Morocco, heard about it. And he thought, might be a good thing to have a young man with an unending supply of gold for a friend. So he invited that young man to his daughter's betrothal breakfast, his daughter's engagement breakfast. He sat the young man right across from the princess. Oh, she was pretty. Long black hair. Her skin was honey-colored, kind of honey-brown colored. She looked at that young man, and then she stood up, and with her pretty little hands, she ding, 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 tapped a crystal goblet. Everyone was quiet and turned to her. Beloved father and honored guests, you all know that I was kidnapped by a wicked magician and forced to live in an old run-down mansion in Portugal until someone was brave enough to spend 3 nights there at great pain. And you all know that someone was brave enough and that I was freed. Beloved father and honored guests, the young man who freed me sits right across the table from me. I knew it was you, she said, because you're wearing my ring and I have yours. I wondered about that, he said. Beloved father and honored guest, should I marry the young man who saved me? Or should I marry this fiancé who's sitting here next to me? And everyone said, oh, you should marry the young man who saved you. And the fiancé said, hey, wait a minute, what about me? Everyone said, oh, you didn't do anything, just be quiet. So the Moorish princess and the young Portuguese adventurer were married. And you know they must have lived happily ever after. Thank you for watching the story.